Here's a number that shouldn't exist. 400 gold sovereigns. That's what the Alpha King paid for a woman with chalk dust still under her fingernails, on an auction block in a square that smelled of wet hay and frightened bodies. 400 sovereigns for a slave he never once touched, never spoke a private word to, never claimed in front of a single witness. The realm still argues about why. This is the truth of it. Her name was Odette, and she had a scar shaped like a fishhook above her left eyebrow, pale and thin, the kind you get from a buckle thrown in anger, not an accident. She stood on the block with her wrists bound in rope, not chain. Her last owner hadn't thought her worth the iron, and she did not cry. She did not look at her feet. She looked out over the crowd like she was choosing them, not the other way around, and that alone made the bidding ugly. 200, called a wool merchant with a wine-stained birthmark across his throat. 250, said a woman in furs who collected pretty things and broke most of them within a year. The auctioneer, a reedy man named Pell with a missing front tooth that made his S's whistle, grinned at the rising number like it was a song he loved. "She's got fire in her," he said, dragging Odette's chin up by 2 fingers. "Fire sells." Odette turned her head and bit him. Not hard enough to draw blood. Hard enough that the whole square went quiet, and Pell snatched his hand back with a noise like a kicked dog, and somewhere in the crowd, a man laughed once, low, like it had escaped him before he could stop it. That was Connor. The Alpha King of the Northern Pax, 6 years, on a throne he hadn't wanted, dressed plain enough that half the square didn't recognize him until his guard shifted at his shoulder. He had a single white claw mark scarred through his left eyebrow, old, war-one, the only part of him that ever looked anything but composed. He had not come to buy a slave. He had come, his advisors believed, to inspect grain prices in the lower market and be seen doing it. He bought her instead. 400, he said, and didn't raise his to do it. The square went silent, the way a held breath goes silent. Pell's whistle of a voice cracked, trying to ask if he'd heard right. The fur-collared woman folded her arms and did not bid again. You don't outbid a king, not unless you want enemies you can't survive. Odette, still bleeding a thin line where her own teeth had caught her lip in the struggle, looked at the man who'd just bought her like he'd insulted her on purpose. "Why?" she said. Not a question. An accusation. Connor didn't answer her. Not then. He paid in coin, counted out by a steward with shaking hands, signed nothing, claimed nothing, and had her walked, not dragged, walked, with the rope cut from her wrists the moment they cleared the square, to a carriage with no crest on the door. She watched him the whole ride, and he did not once meet her eyes, and that, more than the chains she no longer wore, frightened her. He didn't want her looking at him like that. Like she was working out the shape of a trap. She wasn't entirely wrong, too. The castle smelled of wood smoke and wet stone and something underneath both that she couldn't name. Clean fur, maybe, or the particular mineral scent of a wolf pack's den carved into rock, layered under centuries of human habit. She noticed that smell before she noticed the size of the place, before the tapestries, before the guards, who didn't look at her like property, and didn't look at her like a guest either. She noticed the smell because it made her want, absurdly, to put her back against a wall. They put her in a room with a real bed and a basin of warm water, and a door that locked from the inside, not the outside, and she stood in the middle of it for a long time before she trusted that detail enough to sit down. A woman came an hour later, older, broad through the shoulders, with a streak of pure white running through otherwise black hair, like she'd been struck by lightning and lived to tell it poorly. Her name was Hesta, and she ran the king's household the way some women run armies. "You're not branded," Hesta said, setting down a tray. "Not a question. My last owner thought it cheapened the resale." Hesta's mouth did something complicated. "Eat," she said, and left. Odette did not eat. She sat with her hands folded and listened to the castle breathe around her. Footsteps, a dog somewhere, a door, wind finding a gap in old stone. and waited for the part where the price came due. It always came due. She had been owned by 4 people in 11 years, and every single one of them had wanted something. Eventually, that they hadn't said out loud at the start. She fell asleep, waiting for it, and woke at dawn, surprised that no one had come. He sent for her on the 3rd day. Not the 1st, not the 2nd, the 3rd, which she clocked and distrusted, because cruelty that waits is still cruelty, only patient. His study had one window, narrow, north-facing, and a fire built low rather than high, and Connor stood at the window with his back to the door when she came in, flanked by a guard who left the moment. Connor lifted 2 fingers. "Sit," he said. "I'll stand." He turned then. Looked at her. Really looked, the first time he'd allowed himself to since the square, and something crossed his face fast enough that she almost missed it. Almost. "As you like," he said, and crossed to his desk and lifted a folded paper sealed in wax, the deep red of his own house. He held it out. She didn't take it. "What is it?" "Your freedom." The fire popped. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. "Say that again," Odette said very quietly. The way you ask someone to repeat something that might be a cruelty disguised as a kindness, because she had been handed kindness before that turned, in the handling, into something else entirely. "I bought your contract," Connor said, "and I'm dissolving it. You're not indentured. You're not owned. You're not mine." He set the paper on the desk's corner, where she'd have to cross half the room to reach it. "You can walk out that door today, and no man in this kingdom has a claim on you." "Why? Does it matter?" "It's the only thing that matters." He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him decide not to answer her, watch the decision land in his jaw, in the set of his shoulders, and something in her, something old and tired of being managed, went sharp and cold. 400 sovereigns, she said, "for a woman you don't want." "I didn't say I don't want." He stopped, visibly stopped, the words cut off mid-frame, like he'd bitten his own tongue on purpose. Odette crossed the room, picked up the paper, broke the seal herself, rather than let him watch her wait for permission, and read it twice, because the first time her eyes wouldn't focus on the words, only the shape of her own name in unfamiliar handwriting, granted things she had not had since she was 9 years old. "There's no fee," she said. "No service owed. No clause. No clause." Why would a king do that? He didn't answer that either. He went back to the window, put his back to her again, and said, in a voice gone carefully flat, "There's a room prepared if you'd like to stay the week, to rest, before you decide where to go. No one will stop you leaving sooner." She left the study with the papers folded against her chest like something that might still be taken back. And she did not say thank you, because she had learned a long time ago that gratitude was a leash you handed people yourself. She meant to leave within the week. She told herself that for 9 days. It wasn't the bed, though the bed was good. It wasn't even safety, exactly, though the castle was the safest place she'd slept in 11 years. It was that she kept finding reasons to be where he was, not close, never close, but within the radius of him, in the hall when he crossed it, in the kitchen garden when he walked its border at dawn, like a man checking a perimeter. Only he could see, and she told herself she was watching him for the trap. She wasn't entirely wrong about that either. She just wasn't entirely right anymore. On the 9th morning, she found him in the stable yard with his sleeves shoved up, helping a groom wrestle a half-broke mare that didn't want a saddle, and his forearm came away from the work with a long, thin line of blood where the mare's teeth had caught him, and he didn't curse, didn't call for a healer, just pressed his other hand flat over it and kept working, like the pain was an opinion he'd chosen not to have. "You'll scar," she said from the fence. He looked up. Surprised, she thought, that she'd spoken first. "Wolves heal fast," he said. Mostly. Some things leave a mark anyway." He said it looking at her, not the wound, and she felt that look land somewhere under her ribs and made herself look away first, because looking away first felt like the only power left to keep. That night, Hesta found her in the corridor outside the kitchens, restless, and said without preamble, "You're still here. I'm allowed to be." "That's not what I asked." Odette didn't have an answer that didn't cost her something to say out loud, so she said nothing, and Hesta, to her credit, didn't push. She only set a hand briefly on Odette's shoulder, rough and warm, and said, "He freed 3 others before you. 2 men, a woman with a bad hip, paid for all of them. Never once asked any of them to stay. What happened to them? They left." Hesta's eyes were steady, unreadable. "Within the week." That should have settled something. It settled nothing. It only added a question to the pile she was already carrying, heavier now, sharper. If he let 3 people walk, and they walked, why did the 4th one, why did she, keep finding reasons not to? The thing about a man who won't tell you why is that eventually his wolf does it for him badly, in a moment he can't control. It happened in the library of all places on a rain-loud afternoon, when Odette had gone looking for nothing in particular, and found him at a table covered in border maps, jaw tight, a quill snapped clean in his fist from gripping it too hard over some report he hadn't liked. "Bad news?" she asked, because the silence in the room had teeth and she'd rather poke it than sit in it, a raid in the Eastern Valley. 3 farms burned. He didn't look up. "Nothing that concerns you. Everything in this castle concerns me. I live here." That landed. She watched it land, watched something flicker behind his eyes, gold catching the gray. For just a half second, there and gone, the wolf surfacing close enough to the skin that she felt the air in the room change pressure, the way it does before lightning. "You live here," he repeated low, like he was testing whether the words were true or just convenient. "For now." "For now," he said, and stood so fast his chair scraped, and crossed half the distance between them before he seemed to catch himself doing it. Stopping close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, smell rain and wood smoke, and underneath it that low mineral note of fur and wild that she'd noticed the first night and never since let herself name. Neither of them moved. His hand came up, not to touch her, just lifted, hovering an inch from her jaw like he meant to brush the rain-damp hair back from her face, and thought better of it at the very last breath. "Why does it matter so much to you?" she said, barely above a whisper. "Whether I stay." His hand dropped. The gold went out of his eyes like a snuffed candle. "It doesn't," he said, and the lie sat so badly on his mouth that she almost laughed, except it didn't feel like laughing. It felt like something cracking open in her chest that she'd kept locked since the auction block. He left the library without another word. She stood there a long time, listening to the rain, holding the place on her jaw where his hand had almost been, like she could keep the warmth of it through sheer will. It was Hesta, in the end, who said the word neither of them would. She found Odette 3 nights later folding linens in the small hours because sleep wasn't coming, and she watched her work for a while in silence before she spoke. "You know what a scent bond is?" Odette's hand stilled on the cloth. "I've heard the stories. Wolves and their mates, fire songs and faded threads." She kept her voice light, the way you keep your voice light around something you're afraid to want. "Servants' tales. Our king," Hesta said, "has not slept a full night since the day of that auction." She folded her arms. "He didn't go to that square for grain prices. I've run his household 6 years. He's never once lied to me about his schedule before that day." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying a wolf's nose doesn't bargain with him the way his pride does." Hesta's eyes were not unkind, but they weren't soft either. "I'm saying he bought you because something in him recognized something in you, the way a key recognizes a lock it's never seen before, and it terrified him so badly he handed you your freedom rather than risk being the reason you ever felt owned again." The basin of water Odette had been using sat very still in front of her. Then why didn't he say so? Would you have believed him? A king tells a woman he just bought that she's his fated mate. In the same breath, he hands her the deed to herself. What would you have heard? A claim, a new cage with prettier bars. Hesta picked up the folded linens. He gave you the only proof that would have meant anything. The choice to leave. He's been waiting 9 days to see if you'd take it. Odette sat with that long after Hesta's footsteps had faded down the corridor and felt the whole shape of the last 9 days rearrange itself behind her eyes. Every meal he hadn't joined her for so as not to crowd her, every door left deliberately unlocked, every time he'd looked at her and then looked away first, which she'd read as indifference, and which had been, all along, the opposite, restraint worn like armor. She had thought she was the one being watched for weakness. She had been the one being given every day. A door he was terrified she'd walk through. She found him at the kennels near midnight, sitting on an overturned crate with 2 hounds asleep against his boots, looking like a man who hadn't expected company and wasn't sure he wanted it now that it had arrived. Hesta talks too much, he said before she could speak. So he knew. Of course he knew. A king's household has no real secrets, only delayed ones. She talks exactly enough. Odette sat on the crate beside him. Close enough that the hounds didn't stir, far enough that nothing touched. Is it true? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might lie again, might retreat back into that careful flatness she was starting to recognize as his version of a locked door. "The first time I saw you on that block," he said instead, "my wolf went still, not loud, not frightened. Still, the way the world goes still right before something true happens." He looked at his own hands. "I felt nothing like it in 31 years. I didn't trust it. I still don't, entirely. Wolves have been wrong before. History's full of bonds that broke men's lives in half. But I knew if I claimed you on the strength of a feeling you never consented to, I'd be no different than the man who sold you. Just gentler about the chain. So you set me free instead. So I set you free instead." He finally looked at her. "If you'd left in that first week, I'd have let you go and never said a word of this. You'd have walked out not knowing, and that would have been the price. My price, not yours." His jaw worked. "I would rather lose you clean than keep you, because some thread in my chest told me to." The hounds breathed. Somewhere past the kennels a horse shifted in its stall, the soft complaint of straw underfoot. "That's a terrible way to fall in love with someone," Odette said, "buying them and then begging them to leave." A short sound escaped him, not quite a laugh. "I never said begging." "You did it without saying it. That's worse." He almost smiled at that, the white scar through his eyebrow, pulling strange with the movement, and for one unguarded second he looked younger than a king, looked like a man who'd been holding his breath for 9 days and had just, finally, let some of it go. She didn't kiss him. She wanted to. Wanted it with a clean, frightening clarity that surprised her. And she didn't, because some choices need to be made twice before they're trustworthy. Once in the body and once, later, with steadier hands. Instead she reached over, slow enough that he could have pulled away and didn't, and laid her palm flat against the back of his, over the thin, healed scar the mare had left. "I'm not leaving this week," she said. "That's not the same as staying." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She left him at the kennels with that unfinished on purpose, and walked back through the dark castle feeling, for the first time in 11 years, like the next choice in her life was actually hers to make, and underneath that feeling, smaller, colder, the question she hadn't asked him. What happens when the man who once owned me decides 400 sovereigns wasn't a fair sale? That question had a name. She just hadn't said it out loud yet. His name was Dressler, and he had a missing left ear, taken in a knife fight 20 years before any of this began, the scar tissue grown smooth and shining like a coin pressed flat. He had owned Odette for the 11 months before the auction, had sold her not because he was done with her, but because the realm's tax collectors had come asking questions about a girl whose papers didn't match the ones he'd shown them 4 years before, and a quick sale at market had seemed cleaner than an audit. He came back 19 days after the auction. He came on a gray morning with 2 armed men, a folder of papers, and a magistrate's seal. He'd bribed badly enough that anyone who looked closely would see the wax was wrong, the impression slightly off-center. But not everyone looks closely, and Dressler was counting on the castle gate to let him in on threat and confidence alone, the way it had let men like him in all his life. It worked partway. He got as far as the courtyard. "I'm here for my property," he announced, loud, performing for an audience he assumed would side with paperwork over a woman's word the way the world mostly had, his whole life. The woman sold at the Eastern Market 3 weeks past. Papers were never properly filed. The sale to the king is void. Odette heard his voice from the kitchen garden, and her hands went very still over the herbs she was cutting, and something old and small in her chest curled up and went quiet, the way it used to, when she heard his boots on the stairs of his house. 11 months of learning the particular rhythm of a man who never raised his hand but didn't need to, because the threat lived in his voice instead. She walked out to the courtyard anyway. She made herself do it. Some doors you have to open yourself or they stay shut forever. "Odette," Dressler said, and smiled, and the smile was the worst part because it was warm, because it was the same smile he'd used on the day he bought her, the one that had made an 11-year-old's mother believe, briefly, that her daughter was going somewhere kind. "There she is. Did they treat you well, girl? Come on now. Time to come home." "I have papers," Odette said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which she counted privately as a small victory. "I'm free. Papers can be wrong." Dressler held up his own folder, and the wrong wax seal caught the gray light. "Mine say different. Mine say I never released my claim, that the sale was conducted under irregular registration, that you remain, under realm law, my bound property until a magistrate rules otherwise." He took a step toward her. "And magistrates take months, sweetheart. You'll come home with me while we wait." It was, Odette would think later, a very good lie. Confident. Specific enough to sound true. The kind of lie built by a man who had gotten away with smaller ones his whole life and had never once been made to answer for it. Connor came out of the hall before Dressler finished the sentence. He didn't shout. That was the thing she noticed first. The absence of volume when every instinct in her expected a king's fury to be loud. He simply crossed the courtyard at a pace that made both armed men shift their weight, and stopped close enough to Dressler that the smaller man had to tip his head back to hold his gaze. "Show me the seal," Connor said. Dressler's smile didn't waver, but his hand, holding out the folder, did, just slightly, just enough. Connor took the paper, studied it for exactly as long as it took to confirm what Odette already suspected, what she'd learned to read in 11 months of watching this man lie to taxmen and neighbors and once a magistrate's own clerk. The seal was wrong. The wax was the wrong red, pressed with a die that didn't quite match the grooves of a true magistrate's stamp, close enough to pass a glance, not close enough to survive one. "This seal is forged," Connor said, conversationally, the way you'd note the weather. "Badly. I'd be embarrassed if I were you. Now see here. I have seen here." Connor's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Something underneath it had gone very still. The same stillness Odette had started to recognize as the wolf coming close to the surface. Banked, but not loose. Controlled the way a held breath is controlled. "You sold this woman at lawful auction 3 weeks ago. I have the registry signed by the same magistrate whose seal you've just badly forged. You are not here for property. You are here because you heard a king paid 400 sovereigns for a slave girl, and you decided that meant there was more money to be had." Dressler's jaw worked. The smile finally slipped, just at the edges. "She's not worth this fight, Your Grace. She's stubborn, difficult. I'm doing you a kindness taking her off your hands." "Say one more word about what she's worth," Connor said, "and we'll discuss it without the papers." It was the first ugly thing he'd let himself say in front of her, flat, cold, a promise with teeth in it, and for one breath, Odette felt something in her chest brace. The old reflex of a woman who has learned that men's anger, even anger spent in her defense, has a way of turning, eventually, toward the one it claims to protect. It didn't turn. He didn't even look at her. His eyes stayed locked on Dressler, and that, more than the threat itself, was what told her the truth of it. This wasn't a man enjoying his own power. This was a man who had been waiting 19 days for exactly this kind of fight, the kind with a clear villain and a clean answer, because it was so much easier than the fight he'd actually been having. The quiet one, with himself about whether wanting her was a kindness or a theft. Dressler's men exchanged a look and found very quickly that they had urgent business elsewhere. "You have until I count to 10, Connor said. To be off castle grounds. After that, I stop being polite about the forged seal, and we discuss instead what the penalty is under realm law for attempting to re-enslave a freed citizen by fraud. I believe it's the mines. I believe it's permanent." Dressler looked at Odette one last time, and here was the part she hadn't expected, the part that snagged in her chest and refused to be simple, and for one unguarded second his face wasn't cruel, was almost something like rueful, almost something like a man seeing, too late, the size of the thing he'd thrown away for the price of a quick sale. "You were the best worker I ever had," he said, quiet, not performing now. "I'll give you that much." It should have meant nothing. It meant nothing, and it cost her something anyway. Some old, tired part of her had wanted, for 11 months, exactly one true word from him, and now she had it, and it changed nothing at all, and she hated that it still made her chest ache for half a second before the ache turned cleanly into something closer to relief. 8, Connor said. Dressler left without counting the rest. The courtyard emptied slow guards, filing back to their posts, Hess appearing from somewhere with a face like a closed door, ready to manage whatever needed managing. Odette stood very still in the after-quiet of it, hands not shaking, exactly, but not steady either, and Connor turned to her at last, and the fury was gone from his face so completely it was like watching a tide pull back from a shore. "Are you all right?" he said. "Not a king's question. A man's. I don't know yet. He didn't push for more than that." He stood with her in the cooling courtyard while the gray morning light shifted, and after a while he said, "Lo, I should have told you sooner he might come back. You didn't know he would. I should have considered it anyway." His jaw tightened. "I let you walk this castle for 19 days, thinking your freedom was already settled and clean. When men like that exist in the world and I know exactly what they're capable of. That was mine to think of, and I didn't, and I'm sorry for it." It wasn't a grand confession. It was a small, specific failure, owned plainly, and Odette found she trusted it more than any grander thing he could have said. Because it cost him something to say it, the way the truth always costs something when it's real. "You came when it mattered," she said. "That's not the same as not letting it happen at all." "No," she agreed again. The second time she'd said exactly that to him in as many weeks, and this time she let herself almost smile when she said it. "It isn't. But it's still good, Connor. It's still enough." That should have been the end of it. The villain run off, the papers proven true, the courtyard quiet again. It wasn't, quite. Because some debts don't close just because the danger's past. And that evening, alone in her room with the window cracked to let in the cool, Odette found herself doing the thing she'd been avoiding since the kennels. Actually deciding. Not whether she was safe. She was safe. The freedom papers were true, sealed properly, filed in a registry a forger couldn't touch. Dressler was gone and wasn't coming back, not with the mines waiting if he tried. That fear, at least, had a floor under it now. The other fear didn't. Because the truth Hesta had handed her in the dark of the corridor sat differently now than it had 9 days ago. A scent bond. A faded thread. The kind of word that once said, made every kindness he'd shown her suspect in a new way. Not suspect of cruelty anymore, but suspect of inevitability. If some part of him had been pulled toward her before either of them chose anything, how would she ever know? Walking through the rest of her life at his side, whether she'd chosen him or simply stopped fighting a current that had been pulling her toward him from the very first look across that auction block. She lay awake with that question a long time. It was, she realized near dawn, the same question in a different shape as the one he'd been asking himself for 19 days. He'd been afraid of taking her by a bond she never agreed to. She was afraid of being kept by one she might never be able to fully separate from her own wanting. There was only one way to find out, and it required leaving the castle, however briefly, on her own 2 feet, with no one watching to see if she came back. She told Hesta in the morning, plainly, the way she'd learned to tell hard truths since the auction block had taught her that softening them only made people doubt you more. I want to go to the eastern town for a few days. Alone. No guard, no escort. Hesta's eyebrows went up half an inch, the only sign of surprise she allowed herself. Does he know? Not yet. I wanted you to know first, so someone here understands it's not running. It's checking the math. The math. Whether I'd choose this place, Odette said. If I had any other place to choose from. I've never had another place before. I want to stand somewhere that isn't his and decide from there. Hesta studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, slow, like a woman approving a plan she hadn't expected to respect quite this much. He won't like it. He doesn't have to like it. He just has to let it be true. He did let it be true, though it cost him visibly to do it. She found him in the study, told him plainly, watched the muscle in his jaw work the way it had in the courtyard, watched him want, with his whole body, to say no, to send a guard anyway, to do any number of small, controlling kindnesses men, dress up as protection. He didn't do any of them. How long was all he said. I don't know yet. Will you write? If I have something true to say, not before. He nodded, once, and something in his face when he did it reminded her so sharply of Dressler's men's backing away from a fight they'd already lost that she almost laughed. Except this wasn't a man losing. This was a man choosing, again, the same hard choice he'd made on the auction block, to hand over the only leverage he had and trust the shape of what came back. Take the gray mare, he said. She likes you better than she likes the grooms. It was such a small thing to offer, after everything, that it nearly undid her more than a grand speech would have. The eastern town was loud and smelled of fish and tar and wood smoke from 100 chimneys, nothing like the castle's clean stone hush, and Odette spent 4 days there doing nothing in particular. Mending work for coin, a room above a tavern with a window that didn't quite latch. Long walks along a harbor where gulls screamed over fish guts and nobody knew her name or her price. She talked to a woman who sold bread, who had 3 daughters and complained about all of them with a fondness so plain it made Odette's chest hurt in a way she didn't examine too closely. She talked to a fisherman missing 2 fingers on his left hand, who told her, unprompted, that freedom mostly just meant choosing which work nearly killed you, and she'd laughed. The first real laugh she could remember in longer than she wanted to admit. She thought about Connor every single day. Not with longing, exactly. Longing implied an ache for something absent, and what she felt was closer to a held thread, a sense of him existing somewhere to the west, patient, not pulling. On the 4th night, she lay in the narrow tavern bed and asked herself, plainly, the question she'd come here to answer. If she never went back, if the bond, whatever it was, simply faded the way old wounds sometimes do, distance doing the slow work of healing, would she miss the castle, or would she miss him? The answer came so fast and so clean it almost frightened her. She would miss him. Not the safety of the walls, not the soft bed, not even the freedom papers folded in her bag. Though all of those mattered, she would miss the particular quiet of him sitting at the kennels with 2 sleeping hounds at his boots, the way his jaw worked when he was holding back a kindness he wasn't sure he had the right to offer, the small, ugly, satisfying thing in his voice when he'd told Dressler to count to 10. She would miss him the way you miss a person, not a current pulling you toward a fate you never agreed to. She rode the gray mare back west the next morning before the sun was fully up. She didn't send word ahead. She wanted to see his face when she arrived unannounced. Wanted to know, in that first, unguarded second, before he composed himself into a king again, whether what crossed it was relief or merely surprise. She got her answer in the stable yard, where he was up to his elbows in the same half-broke mare's tack, sleeves shoved up, and he heard the gray mare's hooves before he turned, and when he did turn, the look on his face wasn't composed at all. It was something closer to a man remembering, all at once, how to breathe properly. "You came back," he said, and his voice cracked very slightly on the second word, which he would later deny, and which she would tease him about for years. "I went to check the math," she said, dismounting, the dust of 4 days' travel still on her, the harbor's salt and tar smell still clinging faint to her clothes. "I wanted to know if I'd choose you, with every other door open in front of me." He didn't move toward her. She noticed that, the way she'd noticed every restraint of his since the library, since the rain. And she loved him a little more for the no-noticing, for the discipline it must have cost him to stay still, and let her finish. "And?" he said. "And I chose you anyway. Not because some thread in your chest pulled me here. Because a woman at a bread stall complains about her daughters, and it reminded me how much I wanted to come home and tell you about it. Because I missed the particular way you go quiet when you're deciding whether a kindness is yours to give." She closed the last of the distance between them herself. Her choice, her steps, nobody's hand guiding her there. Because freedom was never about leaving Connor. It was about being able to walk back in through that gate and mean it. He reached for her then, slow enough that she could have stopped him and didn't, his palm finding her jaw the way it had almost found it in the library weeks before. And this time he didn't pull back at the last breath. "I have to tell you something," he said, voice rough, "before this goes any further. Tell me." "I don't know if the bond is real. I never tested it. I never let myself, because I was too afraid of finding out it had decided things for both of us before either of us got a vote." His thumb moved, once, along her cheekbone, careful, like he was still asking permission with the smallest motion he had. "I still don't know. I might never know. I love you anyway, bond or no bond, thread or no thread. I loved you on the morning you bit a man's hand on an auction block rather than let him touch you like you were furniture. And that has nothing to do with wolves or fate. That's just you. That's just me, choosing you the same way you just chose me." "Say it again," Odette said. The same words she'd said to him in the study 3 weeks before, when he'd first told her she was free, only this time there was nothing guarded in the asking. "I love you." Again. He laughed, really laughed, the sound startling the half-broke mare into a sidestep neither of them noticed, and said it a third time against her hair as he finally pulled her in, and the kiss that followed was unhurried, certain. The kind of thing two people do when they've both already decided and are only now letting their bodies catch up to the choice. The wedding, when it came months later, was small by a king's standards and enormous by Odette's, she who had once owned nothing. But the dress on her back stood in front of half the kingdom in fabric, the color of harbor dawn, the fishhook scar above her eyebrow visible and unpowdered because she'd refused, flatly, to hide a single mark that had made her who she was. Hesta cried and pretended she hadn't. The bread seller's daughters, invited on a whim Odette never fully explained to anyone, ate 3 times their fair share of cake and were not corrected for it. Dressler, the rumor went, had fled 3 kingdoms over rather than risk the mines, and built himself a smaller life under a smaller name, the kind of ending that isn't justice exactly, but is, perhaps, close enough. A man made permanently small by the one thing he'd once thought worthless. Connor never did learn, with certainty, whether the bond his wolf had felt that first day was fate or chemistry or something, with no name at all. He stopped needing the answer. Some nights, very late, with Odette's head on his chest and her breathing gone slow. And even, he would think about the 400 sovereigns, and the freedom papers, and the 9 days he'd spent terrified she'd walk straight out the gate and never look back. And he understood, finally, that the gift had never really been the gold. The gold was easy. Kings have gold to spare. The gift had been the door he'd left unlocked every single day, even when it cost him everything to leave it that way. That's the part the records never tell you. When they write about a king who paid a fortune to free a woman he'd just bought. They tell you about the sovereigns. They tell you about the scandal of it. The talk that followed him for a season. The bet makers in the lower market who'd wagered on how long the slave girl would last before she fled the castle for good. They don't tell you that freedom isn't really proven in the leaving. Anyone can leave a cage that's been left open out of guilt. It's proven in the choosing to come back. Boots dusty, harbor salt still in her hair, nothing left to compel her. Nothing left to lose by walking the other way, and meaning it enough to stay.